solid ground.
Hello and welcome to Sunday School. We're all getting creative in how we continue our church service. And anyways, sit back and enjoy. We are studying the J curve, and I told everybody in my intro video that I will actually start from the beginning. Our class has been through almost 13 chapters of this book, so I'm going to try to make this short and simple for people to kind of get caught up with everybody. The first chapter in this book is he titled it, Paul Miller titles it, "I Will Never Do This Again." I don't know how many of you people have ever said that same thing. I will never do that again. So let me just kind of give you a little bit of background here. Paul is, throughout this book, or through the 13 chapters, I know Paul has used his personal stories to kind of stress a point of some sort. And he has a wife named Jill and a disabled daughter named Kim. Now Kim, I believe, has, from what I'm understanding, she can't speak, so she uses a speaking device, where she can type out words and whatnot. Of course, any kind of disability child, they like particular things. For example, there's Kim enjoys a voice book that she listens to. So, and sort of that type of thing. So those type of things make their lives easier or more enjoyable. And when you take them away, or if they don't have them, they become irritated. And as you can picture, just a baby with a pacifier. It's a lot of times you calm down a baby, you give them a pacifier, and they're fine. So it's sort of like this, and believe it or not, we all have them. So anyways, so a little background. Paul has a wife named Jill, and they have a disabled daughter named Kim. And so he starts out by telling you a story. He wants to give Jill a break. And Paul, being a pastor, or he's more like a speaker and an author than anything else. That's where his ministry is. So he wants to give Jill a break. So what he decides to do is take Kim on a speaking engagement in Florida. They're from Philadelphia. So if you can picture this, they pack up 2 bags, 2 suitcases, and a box that says "See Jesus" written on it. And I just know this. I'm trying to picture this in my mind, and what keeps coming back to me is my buddy Greg, my best friend in the world, or one of them. I have 2 really good friends, Toy and Greg. Greg has a disabled son, and for him to make a trip anywhere with him is a lot of work. I feel for the guy. I think he's one of the best people in the world. And of course, he goes through his down times and his up times, and he personally struggles with it all the time. And I could speak hours and hours and hours about Greg. But Greg is a very, very good fellow. And when I read this story, I think about him and the amount of work that it takes to care for a disabled child. So this happened back in 2001, and Paul is wanting to give Jill, or his wife, a break, so he decides to take Kim on a trip to Florida for a speaking engagement. So he describes this trip. So I already told you about the two suitcases and the little box, that says "See Jesus" on it. They get to the airport, and of course, when you go into these airports, you see lines everywhere, and you got to go through security and all that stuff. And here he is bringing or taking his daughter with him by himself, might I add. Okay, so anyways, they go into this. They're in the airport, and she's wanting this this audio notebook. Basically, it's a audio book that you can listen to, and she's wanting that out of one of the boxes, and she can't find it. Jill didn't pack it for her, so she begins to whine, and he describes this whine. Is considered, what did he say? She began a low-level whine, one we've considered patenting and selling to CIA interrogators. Says, forget the water torture, just play this tape of Kim and your prisoner will be putty in your hands. So you can tell already that she's not happy because she doesn't have the book, and she's beginning this whine. So imagine a lot of people around you when all this is going on. So then they get to the bus stall, and he says, I told Kim, he says, we had to wait for the bus, and her whining grew louder and more irritating. Everyone was looking at us, and he says, I glanced down at my box, wondering if there was any way I could hide the big "See Jesus" sign. He says, I look like a religious nut. Isn't that funny? When the bus arrived, I had a horrible thought. He says, how will I get all of this luggage and Kim on the bus at the same time? I decided to help her on first, then return for the luggage. As I was getting on with the luggage, much to Kim's delight, the back door closed on him. He says, her well-honed sense of humor kicked in as she grinned broadly as she watched me shouting at the bus driver while being crushed by the door. So here she was, all irritated, to get put on this bus, and because Dad is getting caught in the doors, she's starting to laugh. The ride to the terminal was uneventful. Kim is fine as long as she is moving. But when she got into the check-in area, she found a line that wrapped around the terminal, knowing we'd never make our flight if we got in that line. You can already hear the stress level of Paul. I headed up the escalator, luggage and Kim in tow. As soon as we got to the security, our line merged with another, forming one very long line. And then he continues on, and he talks about how Kim is bumping into the people that are ahead of him, in this line. And a lot of those nice people let them through, which was really nice. He says, and there he talks about it going into the security line, and she's typing in what she's talking about, and the security guard's like, I want that, to run it through the deal, and she keeps writing, it's my voice, and she kept, so anyways, her dad actually took the thing away and ran it through the deal, and of course he describes that the security people really wanted to look inside that "See Jesus" box. So as you can tell, the anxiety level is going through the roof. So then once they get through security, they find out that they're in the wrong terminal. Then they had to ask for a ride to get to the correct terminal, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. Oh, yeah. And also when they get in, they finally make it onto the plane. They describe, so when you get into the plane, they tell you to turn off all your audio or your electronic uh, apparatuses, and cell phones and whatnot. So the one thing that calms Kim down was her audiobook, and one of the things, and he got her all hooked up. She's calm. He's starting to relax, and next thing you know, the flight attendant tells them to turn off all the electronic devices, and of course, she decides as soon as when that happens, then all of a sudden she's in this whining mode, like that's what she wants. So once again, so as soon as when you're relaxed, then the next thing is something else happens, and then something else happens. So he just goes on and on and on talking about all the challenges that were happening just to take a flight to Florida. Now, here's what's pretty cool, is they get there, they get into their hotel room, everything's fine. The next Saturday, Paul starts to reflect on what happened, and he realizes that he'd forgotten the J curve. I'll just read this out. The idea frequently articulated by the Apostle Paul that the normal Christian life repeatedly reenacts the dying and rising of Jesus. Let me say that again. He realized that he'd forgotten the J curve. The idea frequently articulated by the Apostle Paul that the normal Christian life repeatedly reenacts the dying and rising of Jesus. He calls it a J curve because, like the letter J, Jesus' life first went down into death, then up into resurrection. So if you look at this, I don't know if you can see that. You see how he dies, and then he resurrects. And you notice that this side is taller than this side. Okay. All right. Christian life repeatedly reenacts the dying and rising of Jesus. He calls it the J curve. Like the letter J, Jesus' life first went down. Let me do it this way. Went down into death and then up into resurrection. Just like the earthly life of Jesus, the J ends higher than it starts. It's the pattern not only of Jesus' life, but of our lives, of our everyday moments. And he goes on, when Kim and I were sitting in the back of the plane, I thought everything had gone wrong. No, the Apostle Paul says the J curve is the shape of the normal Christian lives. Our lives mirror Jesus's. So once again, and he reflects back onto into the diagram. And maybe I'll put it up here so you can see it a little better. So then he describes, and I like the way Paul does this because he uses everyday stories that people can relate to explain a point. So the next title heading in this chapter is Dying and Rising on the Way to Florida. So this is what he says. As I reflected on how our travel disaster was the beginning of a J curve, if you can picture that, see if I can do it the correct way. I don't know if it's this way or if it's this way. It doesn't matter, really. You could just say he's at the bottom. Which way is it? His Florida trip, it starts right here, and he is headed down into this kind of like this bottom of the J. But eventually he'll come up, and he explains why. He says, I experienced a death followed by a resurrection. Huh. The two are intertwined, as he says. Friday's trip left me drained and weary. You can imagine that, which created a spirit of humility as I taught on Saturday's rising. So remember what he was doing. He was actually headed to a speaking engagement, and he went through a lot of trouble. We say trouble, okay, but in his the way he was feeling, matter of fact, he was sitting there wanting to hide the see Jesus thing because he felt embarrassed by it. But all of the things that were happening to him at that airport, the next day he got to speak. He says, on Saturday I was in front of a group of people who were listening to my every word, and I'm thankful. They were such eager listeners, but being at the center of people's praise and potentially toxic, I'm prone to the leadership sins of over-talking and under-listening. So Friday's dying was God's gift to inoculate me against the pride lurking behind success and popularity. He says the work of love that happens in the J-curve exposes our hearts in unexpected ways. On Friday, in front of 3 different crowds, at the bus shelter, in the security line, and on the plane, I was far too concerned with how I looked. In fact, my desire to hide my See Jesus box at the bus shelter showed I was ashamed of him. The sign was dead on. See, Jesus is the humility. Don't run from his path of weakness. In fact, that's the message of this book. Then he goes on to say, resurrection has multiple faces. After the Florida trip, I told Kim I'd give her $50. Listen to this story. I thought it was funny. Resurrection has multiple faces. Now we're talking about the upside of it. After that Florida trip, I told Kim I'd give you $50 for letting me interview her at the Young Life banquet in Washington, D.C. As I interviewed her about our Florida trip, she giggled, smacking her head at all the funny parts of the story. So the reminiscing of the door closing on him, you know. It was he goes on to say how delighted he was to watch her. He says, after the interview, I stepped aside so she could take her speech computer off the podium and sit down. But she didn't budge. Instead, with 250 people listening, she typed out on her speech computer, M-O-N-E-Y. In other words, Dad, show me the money. How's that for resurrection? Yes. I just find that very interesting on how life throws you curveballs, and we go through J-curves on a daily basis. And this is a really good example of it. But the blessing came with sharing that particular story to 250 people. Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned in here, but I will get to it. Paul thinks of Kim as her best friend. He doesn't think of her as a troublesome person, or he thinks of her as her best friend. I thought that was interesting too. We'll get to that. Now, this next part of the book, or the next segment, is called The Right Time to Rediscover the J-curve. And I read this section more than once, and I thought it was interesting, especially in today's times. He goes on, he says, the collapse, quote unquote, Kim and I went through on our Florida trip is a microcosm of the cultural collapse Western civilization is going through. He's describing his trip to Florida as what we all are going through today. He says, the rising tide of unbelief and lure of secular liberalism touch almost every Christian home. It said 50 years ago, we called the occasional child who walked away from the faith a black sheep. Now almost every Christian home has children walking away from faith. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. A young wife, Sarah, from a healthy church, confided to a friend of his. He goes on, he says, she says, I think I've outgrown my marriage, quote unquote. That's something you might say about an immature boyfriend, but Sarah said she had, quote unquote, outgrown her sacred vows to her husband. She used therapeutic language to mask her betrayal. I was thinking about that. And he goes on to say, Sarah's feelings operated at the center of her decision making. Now, I highlighted that. I don't know if you can see that, but I actually highlighted it. Sarah's feelings operated at the center of her decision making. Almost certainly, Sarah encountered some immaturity in her husband, indistinctly discard the biblical morality she grew up with, be faithful in marriage, and reached for the central moral vision of our age, which he calls feelism, okay? By making, here's what he's saying, just kind of follow me here. How does it, or you, make me feel? We all do this. I'm telling you, we're more prone to do something that makes us feel good than we will do, and those things that make us feel good are typically what we go after. Does that make sense to you? He says, our moral grid, feelism, makes faithfulness the glue of life. Almost impossible. I just thought that was interesting. How does it or make me feel? Our moral grid, feelism, makes faithfulness the glue of life. Almost impossible. Feelism drives emotions to the center, distorting and amplifying them in the process. As we'll discover, the J-curve not only balances our emotions, but helps them come alive. It's true. And when you get more into this book, you'll start understanding, it makes you more aware of what's actually happening. Because we let our feelings get in the way and our emotions get in the way of actually seeing what's really happening. Our world is increasingly filled with people like Sarah, he says, who have inhaled the spirit of this age. To quote William Butler Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, the century cannot hold. So how does the church survive and even thrive when the world is going crazy from the care of the sacred self? That's so true. How are we supposed to grow the church when our emotions and our things that just life gets in the way and dictates what we do and what we don't do, that kind of thing? He goes on, he says, as we shall see, there's no better time than now to rediscover that what Jesus dying and rising means. That's why he's written this book, to help prepare the bride, the wife of the Lamb, for suffering. Wow. We know in our class, and I've taught many times, that suffering is a mercy from God. And that, I remember teaching that, and then like a light bulb clicking in my head, and we'll get more into that later on in this book, where we'll talk more about suffering. Then he goes on to say, he's warning you, he says, but this is not a book on coping with suffering. My goal is his goal is to draw you, the reader, or me and you guys, into the dying and rising of Jesus, to reset your sense of the normal Christian life. Listen, let me repeat that. To reset your sense of the normal Christian life, freeing you from cynicism and despair. Inhabiting the J-curve promises to transform your entire vision of how you engage life, freeing you from the world of resentment, how about this word, touchiness, and just plain old grumpiness, and inviting you into Jesus' world, a world rich with joy, hope, and love. So then he takes a step back, and he's talking about if you go to visit, let's say, a manager or a therapist about the situation in Florida. This is what he goes on to say. He says, the manager looks at my flight with Kim and says, you should have left more time for traveling with Kim. Paul says, true. Then the manager says, it's not wise to combine too many things like speaking and caring for Kim. He says, possibly. And then you should have brought someone to help you. And he goes, yes, I did that the next time. Then the therapist tells Paul, you need to do something for yourself. He says, true. Then the therapist asks, do you have a problem with anger? He says, yes, Kim brings out the best and the worst in me. Then, have you thought of putting Kim in a home? And then Paul says, no, she's God's gift to us. Plus, she's one of my best friends. Both the manager and the therapist have pieces of wisdom, but they miss one thing, love, because they play it safe. They miss life in all its richness. Think about that. They miss it. They miss that not only was God resurrecting my soul and saving me from pride during my trip with Kim, but also that my mini death, that's what he's describing it, my mini death gave Jill a mini resurrection. That's how love works. When I felt ashamed and frustrated with Kim, I mirrored the state of the church. Let me read that again. When I felt ashamed and frustrated with Kim, I mirrored the state of the church. I've forgotten the J-curve. Just as Martin Luther rediscovered justification by faith in the early 1500s, we need to rediscover the J-curve in today's rising storm of unbelief and evil. He says, like a diamond, each facet of the J-curve refracts the light in a slightly different way on the wonder of Jesus' death and resurrection. He goes on to explain that a lot of the other pastors never even heard of the J-curve, and then they're talking about justification, of faith, and what Paul is trying to do in the next paragraph is to finish this chapter. He's basically trying to tell you, let's broaden our minds a little bit when we think about what exactly are we doing here. Yeah, we're justified by faith. But when you look at books like here's what he says. He says the J-curve dominates Philippians 1 and 2 Corinthians, Romans 6 and 8, Colossians 1 and 3, and Ephesians 1, and it's modeled in Philemon, Thessalonians, and Acts, beginning with Philippians. Hello, I'm back. I'm sorry, there was a little glitch there. The camera ran out of battery, so Anyways, I promise I'll get better with that. Anyways, I was just kind of describing where the author is getting a lot of the J curve from a lot of the book or the Bible, and just naming off some of the chapters that really hammers the J curve. And as we go on through the study, I will actually bring out the scripture so that way we can read it together, what it is. But to end this, because I am going a little bit long, I don't mean to do that, but he ends this chapter by saying, because this book is about the gospel in everyday life, I've intertwined his stories with those of others. So he talks about, bring up Luther, Mother Teresa, and Joni, I hope I can say this, Erickson, I believe, Tata. He says, but our main focus is on the Apostle Paul's journey for Jesus and into Jesus. Along the way, we'll encounter leaking Dixie cups, bench warming hockey players, a sheep named Ed, that was kind of funny, and a host of everyday problems. He says these stories don't illustrate the J curve, they embody it. With the goal of helping you retell your stories in the light of the death and resurrection of Jesus. To embody simply means that you give a tangible or visible form to an idea. I like that kind of way of teaching because a lot of times when I talk to my daughter, I will bring up past experiences and some of the stories to kind of help solidify a certain point. And Jesus did that too as well when he talked in parables where people can understand his message. I thank you for visiting with me today. I hope that you enjoy it. You can put comments down here on the bottom. Let me know how I'm doing. If you don't like it, that's fine. Tell me what I need to do better. Maybe there need to be somebody else besides me doing this. I don't know. I'm no good at this, but hopefully I can get better. Anyways, God bless you guys, and we will see you on the next video, and that chapter is called I Take Your Place. God bless. Have a great day.
You are victorious.